Welcome to Tech Talks, a podcast hosted by the Toronto FinTech Association about all things business, finance, and technology. Let's dive into today's episode.
Christopher and Jennifer, and this is the Anti-Money Laundering and Risk Management Tech Talk, where we investigate how this type of financial crime is fought, how COVID-19 has changed trends in money laundering and fraud, and what tools and technology we have to use in the fight against it. So we're joined, I'll let you take it, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks. We're joined by Michael Fox today, who is the Vice President of Risk and Compliance at KOHO. KOHO is a Canadian firm that specializes in no-fee digital banking and reloadable Visa cards. He's here today to discuss fraud and anti-money laundering practices, how KOHO may manage said risks, and more broadly, how firms have adapted to mitigate the consequences of these practices amid the pandemic. So, we'll start off really broad, just to kind of set the scene for everyone, and obviously we'll get into these specific things a bit deeper later on. We just want to touch on a few big ideas first. So as an overview, in fraud and money laundering, for a company, what are the main ways that you kind of approach these risks to combat them?
You really need to do a multi-layered approach when you're combating fraud and money laundering. A lot of firms do separate those. At KOHO, they're hand in hand, and that starts first with prevention. When people are signing up for a product, whether it's KOHO or any other financial institution, you want to make sure you have the right detective controls in place to identify criminals who are trying to sign up with you. Then after they sign up, assuming some of them do get through, and it happens, companies like KOHO use a number of detective controls, looking at things like the source of funds for these people, where the money's going, where they're spending, whether there's international activity, and also commonalities with other rings. If you see large clusters of customers doing the same sort of activity that you know to be money laundering, that's all very telling. So we're and then from that, we're continuing to look after that money goes out. Like I said, where is it going? Are there mass trends here? Do we think this is going for somewhere that's going to be used for foul play, or is it legitimate?
Right. All right. Thank you. Now, we know that with anti-money laundering, and as you've spoken about these trends, a lot of them are the only ways, or some of the only ways to track it is via data. So in what way does data play a role in monitoring anti-money laundering and risk management? And maybe if you could even speak about how machine learning has become a prevalent tool in detecting these unusual client behaviors and these anomalies.
Risk in any financial institution should be the most data-intensive part of the business. You really can't have an effective fraud or money laundering program without a heavy data approach. So it's pretty much table stakes for people that are going to be leading a fraud or money laundering function to have a data background, and that's both like tools like SQL, but also getting into Python and other tools like that. Because if you're not using data to look at these trends in a scalable way and look at trends across big groups of customers, you're really getting into this inefficient looking at customers one at a time en masse for a really long time period. And that's the kind of thing that adds a lot of operational overhead to the business. I hesitate to use phrases like machine learning at times because it is a buzzword that people use, and I'd say a lot of companies have attempted to do machine learning, and I've worked on machine learning. Many of my colleagues in the industry have worked on machine learning, but I'd say to a large extent, what's being used today isn't really true machine learning. There's AI components of it. But there aren't a lot of successful applications where the machine is learning on its own. We're still largely at the stage where you can put in rules, and it can detect patterns based on the rules you put in. But there's companies that are at the forefront of trying to build that reinforced learning process. But usually I'm finding when companies are talking about machine learning, they're talking about the former, where it's really just like a rules-based approach to these kind of things. That said, automation is very important in both fraud and AML, and it is going to be even more important going forward. There's still, if you look at the big banks in Canada, they're employing thousands of people in fraud and AML, and a big portion of those people are looking at events and cases and just grinding through them day to day. And so there's a real opportunity for us in the industry to get that down. Instead of looking at 1,000 cases, to identify maybe the 100 that are true money laundering cases, getting that down to 500, then 200, then 100, using predictive models, and then also automating the flows to file to entities like Fintrac or law enforcement. Today there can be some repetitive data input that you're seeing companies doing for either electronic funds transfer reporting, large cash transactions, and specifically suspicious transaction reporting. It's a very manual process at a lot of institutions still.
Right. So then, if it is as manual of a process as it is, what are some of the issues that you face with that process? Does that represent, I think the bulk of the difficulties when tracking it, and that you have to go through this and it's possibly a time-consuming process, or is it more on the technical side of things?
I think it's both. I think the industry is going in the right direction with this, but just hasn't quite caught up with the automation. But I think it's close. Some of the higher volume stuff that entities are filing on and working cases on, that there is some automation today. For things like suspicious transaction reports where we're trying to catch money laundering, there's still, to some extent, a lot of ask from regulators for detailed write-ups of these things. And a lot of companies just haven't figured out how to automate both the write-up, but also the judgment into whether this is a true money laundering case or not. And that's where you talk about true machine learning. When that is mastered, that will get there. Today at a lot of entities, you'll have your first person who makes a decision on a case, potential money laundering, then maybe even a second review from someone more senior, and then a third review, and all the way there's a write-up and edits that are happening in place. And when I talk to people at these big banks, you'll have a fairly senior AML officer filing 2 suspicious transaction reports in a day, which is remarkably inefficient when there's thousands and thousands to be filed.
Yeah, I kind of have a follow-up question to that. So as you mentioned, each case on an individual basis kind of goes through this write-up and editing process, goes through many people. What portion of those would you say kind of get left behind, or does in most cases does Fintrac or whoever kind of do a good job in handling every single individual case? Well,
within financial institutions, I'd say the majority of cases that are generated are left behind. One of the challenges we have with Fintrac is they don't really tell us. So these things get filed with them into a central repository. And to their credit, they've done a lot of work on data standardization over the last several years to make sure all institutions are filing it the same way. But there hasn't been a great feedback loop on specific cases, where if you go to the United States, the local law enforcement will have access to the reports that are filed with FinCEN. That in Canada, it's a bit more of a black box. Mm-hmm. So people don't necessarily know the fruits of their labor.
Right.
So so since we've mentioned Fintrac, I can give a brief kind of summary to our listeners. So Fintrac is the Canadian regulatory body for all financial institutions. And so kind of something that I've seen from them is that during COVID-19, Fintrac has sort of a little article on about how the pandemic has created some challenges for both money launderers and those trying to prevent them or track them down. So, for example, there's money launderers who may typically rely on high cash flow companies to launder. They may not be as heavily active during this period of time. And also for those trying to catch them, this period of time comes with atypical money movements. So this may affect your like traditional anti-money laundering algorithms. And so there's kind of challenges on both ends. So I guess the question here is, has there been opportunities that you've seen where money laundering has become easier during this time in the pandemic? And how have your anti-money laundering practices needed to adapt and adjust to this?
Yeah, I'll start with the regulatory approach and what companies have been doing. There was definitely some transition that a lot of companies, including us, had to deal with for working from home, and that did cause a lot of companies to fall a little behind on some of this stuff, to the point that Fintrac did issue guidance on whether filings could be a little late, and had to put a hold on audits that were happening in offices, obviously, because people weren't in offices. I think the industry rebounded well and adjusted quickly to that, though, and has responded with changing controls around money laundering detection, and particularly around the fraud modes. That said, from a behavior side, there have been changes. And in a lot of cases, it's made activity that would have been out of the ordinary become more common. And it's also made some stuff that we saw a lot of in the past, maybe not at KOHO, but at other institutions, less common. So for example, most spending has been online over the last 6 months, particularly in those first few months when COVID hit. So you saw a lot of people that maybe didn't have a lot of online spend, a lot of international type of spend. Suddenly we're doing that. Suddenly we're doing more virtual loads. KOHO, did see increased business during that time as people migrated to more online channels. At the same time, signups for accounts at every institution became pretty much almost all anonymous for a little while. And at KOHO, that's something that we have always had to deal with, the fact that we're not seeing those people. But there's some companies that maybe weren't as ready for that, moving to perhaps 100% virtual. There's other stuff that would normally be associated with money laundering, like cash transactions, that became much less commonplace. So to the extent if someone were depositing a lot of cash, for me, that would stick out more in this climate, particularly when restaurants were closed, because they're not taking a lot of cash payments. So I think it became a lot easier to ask where the cash was coming from. Fraudsters in both Canada and the United States have really taken advantage of government benefits, and that's something you will see a lot of articles about if you read. Essentially what they did was take over people's identity for the purpose of enrolling in government benefits, or stole those benefits in some form. That was a Canada problem and a United States problem. There's just a lot of government money flowing to individuals that maybe wouldn't have gotten that before, and a lot of people signing up to this stuff for the first time. And criminals saw an opportunity there and really seized on it. So we all had to redouble our efforts to catch that. And sometimes it was tough, because like I said before, you see people signing up virtually for the first time, suddenly getting government benefits. they look like a fraudster, but maybe they're not. So we're all trying to do the right thing to catch the fraudsters and protect the real people, but not create a bad experience for those real people who need this money.
And so, yeah. So you touched. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
And there's a sympathetic lens to it too. It is tough times for a lot of people, and we want to be there for people, and we don't want to be inconveniencing them at that time. But at the same time, fraud rings took advantage of that too, attempting to play on sympathies, and saying, why are you holding these funds, even though they're fraud, by portraying themselves as an innocent victim, and therefore kind of ruining it for other people.
So something I get in the same vein as this policy that you mentioned is that there was an article written last year, I believe, in the Financial Post. And effectively, the crux of it was that Canada, among Western liberal democracies, has particularly weak anti-money laundering laws. And I believe the estimate was anywhere for between $50 billion and $130 billion had been laundered through Canadian firms, companies, both domestically and internationally in 2018. And so for the readers or listeners or whoever who are not so familiar with Canadian anti-money laundering law, sorry, it's a mouthful, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on what some of these weaknesses are.
Yeah, you'll get different opinions on what the weaknesses are. I've definitely observed that both fraud and money laundering can be based in Canada, but working with schemes that are in the United States, but almost in Canada for protection. My take on Canada versus some other countries is financial institutions work relatively well together in Canada, partly maybe due to proximity. I'd say they don't work directly with law enforcement as well as they do in, say, the United States, for example. And that's I think partly due to the way that the data is shared. Like I said before, local law enforcement in the United States has more access to this information to fight a money laundering, whereas in Canada it's more of a central thing. A big thing that is an issue in Canada is punishments. People who are caught for things like fraud in Canada can get away with a relatively light punishment. I've seen them get away with it and then still get to keep the money. I've had my teams been involved in past places I've worked, actually catching fraudsters in branches, and then hearing a couple months later that they were out on parole and they'd left the country, things like that. So I think it makes Canada a little bit of a safe haven for operating these schemes, knowing that even if they get caught, that the punishment is going to be relatively light. At the same time, there hasn't been as much funding for central law enforcement. For example, I believe the RCMP Financial Crime Unit was disbanded last year, or largely had their funding reduced, pushing out to other law enforcement schemes. Whereas in other countries that just wouldn't be the case. They would fund that relatively heavily for investigation. And we also we have a very diverse country as well, and I think people hide behind that sometimes. There's a lot of legitimate use there, but they people take advantage to blend in and kind of fly under the radar.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, sort of the government disbanding one of their sort of fraud departments or bodies who look after that, has the responsibility kind of fallen more onto the companies, like businesses like KOHO, to sort of manage their own, fraud and money laundering practices? And kind of additionally, this might be sort of a question, from the eyes of the law, is that not kind of, whose responsibility is it? Is it not vigilante justice to sort of have a company kind of deal with, say, a criminal from end to end, versus the government's role in that?
I think it's all of our responsibility. I think there's been times when legislation in Canada has lagged behind that of other countries, for everything from how you identify people all the way through to what you should report on. I think it's maybe been not as much of a legislative priority. But I think the onus is on us all as well to take these things seriously, and it's easy to turn a blind eye maybe when it's not costing you money or it's not obvious, but it is on all of us to crack down on this dirty money and make sure that as a financial sector we're not benefiting from it. So
yeah, makes sense.
All right, so
Oh yeah, Christopher,
yeah.
you can go ahead.
So you briefly mentioned stories where you had, it sounds like you had physically caught these fraudsters in branches of banks in instances like that. But could you elaborate maybe on some of the more exciting or, just general notable experiences or memories that you have of dealing with fraudsters or money launderers?
Yeah, there's been a lot of those. One that I wouldn't call exciting, but that I was happy to contribute to in the past was an example where we saw indications of human trafficking based on the way the money was flowing, and we were able to contribute that information to law enforcement, and later saw that results in arrests, and real people actually helped as a result of our efforts. And there's been larger efforts in the industry to coordinate on things like that, led by some very passionate individuals in the AML industry who have done that on a grander scale. And I'm really happy to see institutions and law enforcement cooperating like that to help real people. And then there are a number of others that I've been happy to help on. We're on things like elder abuse too, where we saw indications that somebody was stealing from the elderly, and then not only committing that financial crime in the form of fraud, but then also laundering the funds. And again, we were able to intervene multiple times, look at the funds flow, report that to law enforcement, and again, actually help real senior citizens who are being taken advantage of there. And that's a very gratifying thing, that like there's the numbers of fraud and the case counts and what's going on in Canada, but I think we need to remind ourselves that these things actually usually have real victims. And it can be you or me having our identity stolen to open a credit card. It can be a victim of human trafficking. It can be a senior citizen having their money stolen. And that by strengthening our controls on this stuff, you help real people, and that's something I get really passionate about.
Yeah. See, I guess what's surprising to me is that, I think when most people think of anti-money laundering and fraud, it's a very statistical matter. It's very much, you can get bogged down by the numbers and you forget that behind all of those are individuals who are in fact suffering. And so I guess my question is for you then, would you say that for your work, is that one of the main motivations behind it? Is that one of the main reasons, I guess, that you continue to pursue the work that you do?
That is a big reason why I pursue the work that I do. Also, many times when these individuals are conducting fraud or laundering money, it's leading to other things down the line, like terrorist financing, for example, like other things that are bigger societal problems. So it's not just about the financial loss. You got to think about where that money is going as well, and that's, sometimes it's just someone evading taxes, and I know people don't get as passionate about that. But when it's going to things like terrorist financing or terrorist organizations, that's a really important thing for us to combat. And very often with fraud that's taking place in Canada, that's what's happening.
All right. Jenny, do you have any more? Would you like to ask the last question?
Yeah, I can ask. Yeah, so you have a pretty diverse background just from working at different firms. But just to give our listeners a bit more background, before KOHO, you were the head of fraud at Capital One, and also leading the fraud and AML team at Meridian Credit Union. So KOHO as a startup, there's a very the product offering is just the one prepaid account, and the user pool is I'd say smaller than Capital One and the Meridian Credit Union user base. So my question is around the difference in sizes and product offerings. Does that affect how you approach kind of risk management and your AML practices, in the sense that, like, first of all, scale, and also between different products that you offer?
Absolutely. First things first, there's a number of ways that people normally commit fraud or launder money that are not elements of risk at KOHO today. We don't accept cash deposits yet. We don't accept checks. We don't have things like international wire transfers. We don't have branches where people can make deposits, and we don't have businesses too. And I've dealt with businesses at places I've worked in the past, and when you're dealing with that, you need to look at who owns the business, where the money's coming from for the business, and do some really complex enhanced due diligence. So to a large extent, the risks that we have at KOHO are simplified. That said, we're also 100% virtual, so 100% anonymous. So we've had to be very leading edge at finding ways to allow people to open KOHO accounts, but making sure that they're who they say they are. And so that's really driven us to jump on regulatory changes around things like photo ID as quickly as they became available. Because of our scale, we're not a 10,000 employee bank at this point. We're a much smaller institution. We have to be creative and nimble about the controls that we're coming up with. And so because of our scale, we have to do that. But because we're new, we also have the opportunity to build things for the first time without legacy systems hanging over our neck. So we've really pursued new technologies where we can, risk models, working with the leading vendors, and have been able to, I think, move quickly to market with those things. Again, knowing that today we have simplified risks, but in the future we're going to have much more.
That's great. And sorry, I said earlier that was our last question, but we actually had one more, and this is with the series. What we always try to do is relate it maybe a little bit more to the student body, as those that comprises the majority of our viewer base and reader base. So for those students who would be interested in working in risk management and to pursue careers similar to what you have done, what skills would you recommend that they work on? Both technical and soft. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please. Yeah, my question was done.
I actually started my career in marketing analytics, and for anybody looking to get into risk, I actually recommend you do a stint in like a marketing or product role. And for anyone looking to get into marketing or product, I recommend you do a stint in risk, because it's really good to bring that balanced perspective to the business. That said, for risk, and anyone who wants to get into a leadership capacity in fraud, money laundering detection, credit risk, you do want to have a strong background in analytics. You need to be comfortable with data, and that's first off, just being really good at Excel. But also, if you don't know SQL today, lots of ways to learn it for free online. Go online, work through the modules, learn SQL as best you can. Increasingly, I do find people getting into Python as well. and that's a really good skill for some of the things that we're trying to do in the future. It can be a very technical profession, but also very lucrative profession if you're bringing those technical skills. On a more designation certification perspective, if you're going into AML, the CAMS certification through ACAMS has pretty much become the industry standard at this point. Within fraud, there's the CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner. Usually people with a fraud operations background get into that stuff. My own opinion is you can learn that stuff through experience. And then I almost find people who do the CFA bring a set of well-rounded analytical skills to any problem. So it's not just about having looked at 1,000 fraud cases in the past. It's about being able to look at a set of information quickly, find the trends, like all the credit risk is in this pocket, all the fraud risk is in this pocket, and then come up with insights that you can distill quickly. And so that's just anything you can do to build up your analytical capacity at this point is what I would recommend for that.
Well, to be respectful of your time, I think we've gotten through everything that we needed to in due course. So thank you very much, Michael, for joining us and for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. We really appreciate it. And I think I've personally learned quite a lot, as I'm not someone who is particularly versed in the topic. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris and Jennifer. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Tech Talks. We'll see you in the next one.